Welcome. This is Glenn, and you're listening to Wild Earth Conversations. Wild Earth Conversations is about engaging thoughtful individuals in meaningful conversations that connect their interests and insights to the vision of a thriving and beautiful planet. My guest today is Howie Wolke. Howie Wolke is an American wilderness advocate and defender. He was a co-founder of the visionary Earth First movement in 1980 and co-author, along with Dave Foreman, of the classic environmental text, The Big Outside, first published in 1989 and updated in 1992. This book remains an advocacy tool for raising awareness about how much wild land remains in America, how it's distributed, and how vulnerable it is. Much has changed since its publication, but it remains a valuable baseline. Howie also wrote the important book Wilderness on the Rocks, published in 1991, arguing the need for lower elevation wilderness. He recently retired after 41 years as a wilderness guide in Montana and elsewhere. He lives with his wife just north of Yellowstone National Park. Currently, he is active with the environmental organization Wilderness Watch. For almost 50 years, he has been on a path, personal and political, to find and secure big wilderness. Because of his uncompromising love for true wilderness, I think of him as the Ed Abbey of Montana. Welcome, Howie.
Well, thank you, Glenn. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, and that's putting me in some pretty high company, calling me the Ed Abbey of Montana, but I appreciate it.
Okay. What would you like to say to us at the outset before I ask you a series of questions?
Well, I got a few things to talk about, Glenn, and one of the things I want to mention after listening to your introduction that I am proud to be a co-founder of the original Earth First that I co-founded with Dave Foreman and others in 1980. And I just want to clarify that I consider myself a co-founder of the original Earth First, but not of the entity that's out there nowadays going by the same name, because their focus is not on wilderness and wildlife like the original Earth First was. And that's why I quit Earth First in 1990, because it was going in a different direction. Other than focusing on protecting wilderness and wildlife habitats. But as far as what's going on right now is concerned, I think we're all in pretty good agreement that we live in challenging times, particularly for people who care about the survival of our imperfect democracy, as well as those who are very concerned about the global environmental crisis. And as I see it, we have four major challenges when it comes to the global environmental crisis, and one is climate change, another is biodiversity loss, yet another one is the loss of wild habitats and roadless lands, which is closely related to biodiversity loss. And of course, the fourth major threat to life as we know it on Earth is overpopulation. There are simply too many humans on the planet. But I'm not a demographer, and my expertise isn't in climate change. I'm focused on public lands and protecting wilderness, wildlife, and related natural and wild habitats. And most people don't realize, most Americans don't realize that about almost a third of the land area of the United States is public land that belongs to all Americans. It's the birthright of all American citizens, and the highest level of protection we have for those public lands is designated wilderness under the Wilderness Act of 1964. That's the highest level of protection we have in the United States. What is wilderness? Some of your listeners might be wondering, and there's been a lot of misconceptions about wilderness, but we have a very good series of definitions of wilderness under the Wilderness Act of 1964, and that includes the language as follows. Wilderness is defined, among other things, as an untrammeled landscape. That's not to be confused with the word untrampled. This word is untrammeled right out of the Wilderness Act, which means land left to its own devices, unregulated, uncontrolled, and in other words, wild. Wilderness areas are also considered to be roadless, in a natural condition, undeveloped, with their primeval influence, and there is a mechanized transportation is not allowed in designated wilderness areas. The Wilderness Act also instructs the agency land managers to maintain the wilderness character of a designated wilderness. Today we have about 100 million acres, a little over 100 million acres of designated wilderness, about half of which is in Alaska. But while that sounds like a lot of land, Glenn, it really only amounts to 4% of the entire United States. And if we look at the lower 48 states, where most of the population lives, a little less than 3% of the lower 48 states is designated wilderness. On top of that, we have what are commonly called roadless areas, which are exactly what it sounds like, areas of the public lands that have no roads, that remain in a wild condition, that usually include really good and important wildlife habitats, but these lands have no formal congressional protection as designated wilderness. So we consider them de facto wilderness or small W wilderness. But the important thing to remember is that roadless areas represent the potential for greatly expanding the National Wilderness Preservation System. There are about 50 million acres of unprotected roadless lands, for example, just in America's National Forest System, managed by the U.S. Forest Service. And those 50 million acres are in jeopardy. For many decades, the Forest Service has prioritized logging, road building, oil drilling, mining, off-road vehicles, livestock grazing and livestock overgrazing. In other words, all the various forms of multiple use that some people refer to as multiple abuse, to whittle down the acreage of these roadless areas so that every year we lose potential additions to the wilderness system. A major job of wildlands conservation is to halt ill-considered developments in these remaining millions and millions of acres of unprotected roadless lands, and eventually get these areas into the National Wilderness Preservation System as designated wilderness. Another equally important aspect of the conservation movement is to make sure that once these areas are designated wilderness under the Wilderness Act of 1964, that agency land managers in the Forest Service, the Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, or the BLM actually manage these areas in a way that maintains their wild, untrammeled nature. In other words, the Wilderness Act requires agency land managers to keep wilderness wild. I talked about the roadless areas that are potential wilderness additions to the wilderness system. And since the end of the Clinton administration, roadless areas in the national forests have had a lower level of protection called the roadless rule that under most circumstances forbids the construction of roads and large-scale timber operations and other types of development in these undesignated as wilderness roadless areas. And unfortunately, while that roadless rule has been in effect for over a quarter of a century now, the Trump administration is going through a process to rescind the roadless rule and reopen all these areas up to various forms of abusive land use practices. People wonder why we need to get wilderness designated, what's so important about keeping areas undeveloped on our public domain. And there's a lot of reasons for wilderness, including wilderness provides the best opportunity to maintain healthy populations of native wildlife by protecting the habitat. Many of us feel, I certainly believe, that we owe it to the planet to set aside some areas as off limits from the heavy hand of humanity. In other words, intrinsic value. I would argue that wilderness and undeveloped wildlands and other natural landscapes have intrinsic value just because they are. And I think a lot of people would agree with that. Wilderness is also about restraint. The main author of the Wilderness Act was a fellow named Howard Zahniser, and the late Howard Zahniser, in discussing the Wilderness Act, mentioned that administrators and citizens need to be guardians of wilderness, not gardeners. In other words, we don't know it all. We never will know it all. And the best hedge against taking ill-considered actions is to leave some areas intact to freely evolve. And in that sense, when in doubt, leave it alone. In that sense, the working to protect additional wilderness areas and working to protect the wilderness areas that we do have now is an exercise in humility. It takes us beyond self, and I think that can only lead to good things. It's about time we recognize that we need to leave some parts of this planet alone. And I'm a supporter of the Half Earth campaign, which was started by the renowned ecologist E.O. Wilson, with the idea of setting aside half the terrestrial habitats on the planet as nature reserves. It doesn't mean they would all be absolute wilderness, but they would at least have some form of protection to continue to allow natural processes to persist. And I think that's a great goal to shoot for. After all, we humans are only 1 out of 10 million, out of an estimated 10 million species on the planet. And I think turning 50% of the planet over to one species out of 10 million is more than fair. We're in a crisis. There's no doubt about it. But there's a lot that individual people can do about it. Today's situation is not entirely unprecedented. There have been threats to wilderness and public lands throughout our history, and I'm confident that the wilderness idea will persist as we move forward into the somewhat scary decades that lie ahead. So we need to organize, and I want to caution people that jumping on the bandwagon of some of the bigger, more well-known environmental groups is not going to get us to where we want to get, because many of these big green groups have lost their way and are more interested in fundraising and compromise than they are in truly protecting wildland ecosystems. But don't fear, because there are also a lot of good, really good, effective conservation groups out there that people can align with. And just to name a few in the western United States, because that's where I'm most familiar with the situation, Wilderness Watch is a group that I've been involved with for many years on the board of directors that focuses its efforts on making sure that agencies manage designated wilderness under the Wilderness Act of 1964. And when they break the law and try to get away with something, Wilderness is there to file a lawsuit or otherwise organize to stop illegal assaults on designated wilderness. But a lot of other groups are also working to add worthy areas to the National Wilderness System, and some of those groups include Friends of the Clearwater in northern Idaho, Friends of the Bitterroot in western Montana. There's a national to regional group called Western Watershed Project, Sage Steppe Wild, the Wyoming Wilderness Association, the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, a group called New Mexico Wild. And there's a lot of other groups out there, too, that are easy to find nowadays on the Internet. But again, I caution the listener not to jump in the sack, so to speak, with groups that are more interested in compromising than they are in saving wilderness ecosystems. So get involved. Grassroots organizing is not only the best way to protect wild habitats, but to a great extent, it's the only way. It's worked in the past. It'll work again in the future. And we just have to keep wilderness and the need to protect public wildlands on the table as we go through the challenging political era that hopefully will end before too terribly long.
Thank you, Howie, for that excellent summary. Before I ask you some questions, I need to let you know that I write the questions before the interview. So you've already more or less answered some of these questions, but the issues are so important that I don't think it will hurt to repeat them. So I'm going to ask you question number one. What I have noticed over the course of my life in pursuit of wilderness is that most people do not know what it is. I can't tell you how many times I have been on hiking trails with others only to be disappointed by human intrusions, then to discover afterwards that others felt that they had a genuine wilderness experience. It's very hard to preserve and expand something if people do not know what it is. Have you encountered this problem?
Yeah, I've definitely encountered that problem. I made my primary living for 41 years as a wilderness guide, guiding mostly backpack trips, some canoe trips, but mostly backpack trips without any pack horses or mules or anything like that. Self-contained backpack trips in wilderness areas and national parks and wildlife refuges from northern Alaska to literally south of the Mexican border. And I've guided probably between 500 and 600 roughly week-long treks in wild places, taking out hundreds, if more likely thousands of people, exposing them to wilderness. And the vast majority of our clientele were educated, affluent people who are well-read, and yet they had no idea that our public lands weren't protected without the additional layer of wilderness designation. And so we got in the habit of having a campfire talk out in the wilderness on all of our trips, in which we kind of explain to people what wilderness is. And, just a couple of general concepts that I touched on earlier is that wilderness is not just a chunk of undeveloped land, because a chunk of undeveloped land that looks like a blank spot on the map could have pipelines and power lines going through it. It could be so overgrazed by livestock that it doesn't even resemble the natural ecosystem that it once was. It could have badly eroding scars and gashes across the landscape from off-road vehicle use. So just because an area looks like it's unroaded and undeveloped on the map does not necessarily mean that we would call it a wilderness, because a wilderness is an undeveloped landscape that's still largely in its natural condition, in which natural processes such as natural insect outbreaks, natural wildfire, floods, landslides, all of those things, predation, the very forces that drive evolution are allowed to continue in designated wilderness. So we're talking about a big undeveloped landscape that's still more or less in a natural condition and not completely controlled by the heavy hand of humanity.
Okay. So you already mentioned, I think, some of the defining characteristics of wilderness: untrammeled land, primeval appearance, substantially unnoticeable human intrusions. But the size or the vastness is also key. So in regard to an authentic wilderness experience, what do you say about the issue of size?
The Wilderness Act very clearly defines wilderness as an area that's over 5,000 acres in size, or of sufficient size to provide the opportunity for solitude. And it's generally recognized to have a 5,000 acre minimum. 5,000 acres isn't very big. That is, as I do a little bit of mathematic calculation in my aging cranium, that is about 8 square miles. And a healthy person can walk across that in less than an hour. So this is discussing the legal definition of wilderness. Now, of course, many wilderness areas and potential wilderness areas in our nation are much larger than that. But there are many areas that are in the 5,000 to 10,000 acre range that are important for remaining protected, and especially in the eastern United States, where you just don't have the opportunities for the big wild areas that we have in the West.
In your personal experience, what size for you personally would it have to be at a minimum to make possible an authentic wilderness experience?
That depends on what type of terrain you're in. For example, if you're in flat, open terrain where you can see people miles and miles and development miles away, you might need a bigger chunk of country for that personal experience than you would in an area of rolling forested hills where you can't see more than 100 yards in any direction around you. But I have always, in the back of my mind, tried to live near big chunks of wilderness that exceed 1 million acres. So, I could answer that question with, on a strictly a personal level, again, this has nothing to do with the legal definition in the Wilderness Act, but strictly on a personal level, I like to live near and be able to look out my window and see a wilderness area of at least 1 million acres. And I'm looking right out my office window at the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness, which is 900,000 plus acres of designated wilderness, but the actual wildland size is a bit bigger than that, up to about 1.2 million acres, because there are unprotected roadless areas contiguous with the wilderness, as well as an unroaded portion of Yellowstone National Park. And that kind of brings up another thing I'll throw in here, even though you didn't ask about it, Glenn, is when discussing wilderness and the different types of areas that are protected as wilderness, it's important to look at what is wild on the ground, because oftentimes when you look at a map of a wilderness area, it doesn't give you any clue that the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness, for example, is contiguous with a fairly large unroaded portion of Yellowstone National Park. And so that's why Dave Foreman and I wrote The Big Outside, which you graciously mentioned in your introduction here. And we wrote The Big Outside to get people to look at the entire wilderness landscape, regardless of agency jurisdictional boundaries.
Okay, thank you very much for that. There have been attempts over the last 20 years to define wilderness as peopled wilderness or indigenous wilderness, with some folks arguing that America at the time of Lewis and Clark was not a wilderness because so many North American Native Americans lived here and they used fire to manage the landscape. Your response?
That's a great question, Glenn, because it brings us to a subject that has been beset with a lot of really serious misconceptions, and you just named a few of them, that I'll address. And, I have nothing but respect for indigenous tribal people who wish to honor and continue many of their old traditions. But realistically, when we look at the history of this landscape, the idea that the entire landscape was peopled and modified by indigenous people is ludicrous. There were certainly areas, especially in the East and what's now the Midwestern United States, where there were indigenous people who had permanent habitations, practiced agriculture, and there were heavily peopled landscapes. That probably constituted maybe 5% of the landscape of what's now the contiguous 48 states. To put that into perspective, Glenn, today we have 306, I think the population of the United States now is about 360 million people in an industrialized nation in which about 10% of the landscape is still in a wilderness condition, despite this population of 360 million industrialized humans. The most experts estimate that the pre-European population of what's now the lower 48 states was no more than 1 to 5 million. And so when people say that 1 to 5 million largely Stone Age to agrarian people without industry, without road building technology, created non-wilderness over the entire landscape of the United States, that just makes no sense. But recent research has proven that, yes, there were areas of indigenous habitation that wouldn't be called wilderness by any stretch of the imagination. But despite these people areas, the vast majority of what's now the United States was unpeopled wilderness, which, doesn't negate the importance of the history of indigenous people in this country, but it's just the reality of the situation that small a number of people could not possibly have wiped out most of our wilderness. And in addition, recent research has actually documented the limited extent of native burning, for example. They did quite a bit of burning in and around these populated areas, but those areas were surrounded by vast, vast, vast tracts of what we would now call wilderness.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Do you think that the 1964 Wilderness Act, once the compromises that were necessary to enact it into law have been fixed, and I know your organization, the Wilderness Watch, is focused on that. Once they are fixed, do you think that it is the best model for wilderness preservation around the world, not just in America?
That's a big question, Glenn. I think it should be a model for conservation efforts in much of the world, but the exact language of the Wilderness Act in the United States, should that be adopted in Kenya or Nepal or anything like that? I don't really feel qualified to say it, except that something like our wilderness system should be enacted on a global scale, just about everywhere. And there's another misconception about wilderness, Glenn, and that is that wilderness represents completely pristine land that has never been affected by humans. That's not what the Wilderness Act says, and that's not how most people who understand wilderness define wilderness. In other words, if you look at just about every designated wilderness area in the eastern United States, it's all second-growth forest that was clear-cut and roaded and logged to smithereens in the late 1800s or early 1900s, but they've been left alone for a century and have regained a measure of wildness. And if they're being left alone, they're gradually retaining their untrammeled qualities. So wilderness doesn't have to be pristine. Let's face it, there's literally no place on Earth that hasn't been affected one way or another by human activities, from climate change to air pollution to pavement. So we need to realize that the American model for wilderness can be applied to nature reserves in many parts of the world, but we also have to understand that each country has a different culture, and there may need to be adaptations.
Okay, well, first, let me say I know these are big and difficult questions, and I'm not so much looking for answers as just to get your reflections on some of these things. So do you think that the high goal of saving biodiversity, including apex predators, is the best path for securing true wilderness?
It's got to be a combination of focusing on apex predators and maintaining the largest chunks of habitat possible. Apex predators have a real hard time persisting in heavily peopled, non-wild landscapes. And so they're kind of an umbrella species is one term that biologists use. If you can protect enough wild habitat to maintain a healthy population of grizzly bears or gray wolves, for example, or wolverines, then there's a pretty good chance you're protecting enough habitat to maintain populations of most other species. There's definitely a connection between apex predators and our efforts to protect habitat. And, to me, at least in the western United States, a wilderness area without grizzly bears, it just falls short of what wilderness is supposed to be. It falls short of the visionary efforts to secure a national wilderness system by people like Howard Zonheiser and Bob Marshall, Aldo Leopold, Marty and Olis Murray, and I could go on. But, apex predators are absolutely a big part of the equation.
Okay. Well, the reason I asked this question is because sometimes I get concerned about the focus on biodiversity because grizzly bears without wilderness, for example, is far from the ideal that we are seeking. So I just put that out there as a thought. For example,
well,
it might be possible viable population of wolves in Colorado, but if the territory they live in is shot through with roads and ranches, then this is far from the ideal situation.
Well, if you're talking about wolves in a place like Colorado, if it were entirely shot through with roads, ranches, fences, reservoirs, so on and so forth, you would not be able to have a viable population of wolves. I think there's, I'm from Montana. I don't know Colorado all that well, but I've done some guiding in the Weminuche Wilderness in southwestern Colorado. In fact, we used to meet our clients for those trips in Grand Junction. And I think there is enough wilderness in Colorado, enough wilderness and unprotected roadless habitat, and populations of prey species like elk to support a population of wolves, to support a healthy population of wolves. I
agree with that.
But the key is not only to protect that habitat, but it's also to protect wild thought. In other words, if people will not accept having wild wolves on the landscape, and their reaction to wolves is to shoot, shovel, and shut up, you're not going to succeed in maintaining a population of wolves. And we're seeing threats to our wolves in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem now because we have plenty of wildland habitat to support wolves, but now the states of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming have instituted hunting seasons on them. The populations have been trimmed down, and there's no guarantee that the greater Yellowstone population of wolves or wolves in the northern Rockies are going to persist forever into the future because of these threats and because of people's attitudes, particularly the attitudes of some of the politicians that we so erroneously elect to office.
So if you were on a wilderness backpacking trip and you came across a herd of cattle in a wild meadow, how much, this is a personal question, how much would this affect your wilderness experience?
And I will give you a very personal answer. It would affect it profoundly. I made it a point during my 41-year guiding career to avoid areas whenever possible that had livestock grazing because they completely destroy the natural qualities of a landscape. They bring in weed infestations that replace native vegetation. Every pound of grass that a cow eats is a pound less that's available for elk or moose or deer or any other form of wildlife. They foul streams. They destroy stream banks. They are the primary reason that there's an agency called the Department of Wildlife Services in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, I believe, that does nothing but kill predators in order to make the land safe for livestock. Thousands and thousands and thousands of wolves, bears, coyotes, foxes are killed in the name of protecting the public lands ranching industry. And so I know I kind of got off on a jag here, but I tried real hard to avoid areas with livestock grazing during my guiding career. And circling back to your original question, I don't consider it to be a real wilderness experience when you're in a place that has cattle or sheep.
I agree with you. Another personal question. What is the wildest spot in America on which you have stood? And can you at least try to describe this experience? I believe Ed Abbey gave up trying to do so in words, but I will ask you to attempt it anyhow.
I'll give that a shot with two different answers. In the lower 48 states, the most distant place from a road in the lower 48 states is in the Thoroughfare River Valley, just outside the southeast entrance of Yellowstone National Park in a wilderness area called the Teton Wilderness. It's 21 miles from the nearest constructed road, and that's as far from a constructed road as you can be in the lower 48 states. Dave Foreman and I were the first to discover that, and we published it in The Big Outside. And I have stood there and contemplated the unparalleled wildness of a place like that, even though there are much bigger, more remote places in Alaska and northern Canada, for example. Probably the wildest place I've ever been anywhere in my life would be pick and choose any of the trips that I guided in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in northeast Alaska. You can walk through that country for days, if not weeks on end, without coming to any sign that the human race even exists, except maybe if the weather's good, an occasional airplane might fly over. But aside from that, we're talking about a 19 million acre wildlife refuge that's the size of South Carolina, without a single road in it and without a single constructed trail. The only trails in the refuge are made by caribou during their migrations and other wildlife. And not only that, but
try to describe what you find there when you are in the middle of such a wild place.
I find a feeling of oneness with the natural world and the natural forces of evolution that I don't find anywhere else. I feel a connection, a love of life, land, liberty, freedom. And I mean this liberty and freedom, not just for the two-legged mammals, but for all of the creatures that depend on wild habitats. I just get a feeling in a place like that that's like no other. And in the Arctic Refuge, you're not only in a 19 million acre preserve is as big as South Carolina, but it's adjacent to and contiguous with the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge two national parks on the Canadian side of the Yukon Territory border. It is truly a wilderness without equal probably anywhere on Earth. And I can't tell you how great that makes me feel, that there still are a few places like that, even here in a quarter way through the 21st century. And I'm grateful. And I'm also, when I'm in a place like that, I'm grateful for the efforts of the individual human beings who made the effort to get these lands protected.
I feel that too. Leopold said that some people can live without wild things and some people cannot. Do you agree with this, or do you think that all humans, in one way or another, suffer from the loss of real wilderness?
Well, all humans do suffer from the loss of wilderness in many ways, because wilderness provides clean water. It provides there's a clean air reservoir, and we all breathe. We all need clean water. Wilderness provides it provides not only for human recreation, but it also provides food in terms of hunting wild game. Yeah, you know, I strongly believe that everybody benefits from wilderness, whether they know it or not. But that's a little different than the question of can they live without it. I think if you go to any large mega city in the United States or anywhere in the world, you'll find that there's lots of people who live without wilderness, but they're benefiting from it whether they know it or not.
I had a friend tell me several years ago that big wilderness, as I explained it to him, is obsolete. He's focused on sustainability of natural resources and healthy ecosystem functioning. What would you say to such a person?
You can't have healthy ecosystem functioning without some of those ecosystems being left to their own devices as wild places. What your friend was telling you is something that you hear pretty often nowadays, that it's based on the misconception that there's no such thing as it's based on the misconception that because there's no such thing as completely pristine wild nature, that there's no such thing as wilderness, and therefore we ought to just manage the landscapes for the benefit of humanity in a sustainable manner. And that's a cop-out. That's a cop-out for people who just aren't willing to roll up their sleeves and set aside real areas as wilderness for all species, not just humans. It's not just about what's beneficial for humans. It's what's beneficial for the planet and all species. And you are not going to have a sustainable economy if you ignore the need for preservation of large tracts of wild country. So it's an anthropocentric viewpoint of the world. It's human-centered. It believes that the only it's based on the belief that humans have more value than other wild species, and therefore we have a right to modify the entire planet for humanity, and we don't.
Okay. I have personally been asked by environmentalists not to advocate this and not to advocate that because it will alienate too many people. Personally, I don't think we should hide or shy away from the goal of a half-wild Earth. I don't think we should tailor our message or vision to more appropriately suit the audience we are addressing. What do you think?
I agree with you 100%. I think that one of the weaknesses of many of the bigger conservation groups and it's one of the reasons why I don't support a lot of those groups, is because they think that in order to get anything protected, you have to whittle down your proposal to something that is inoffensive to all involved. And that just doesn't work. We need to protect everything that remains wild, and then we need to rewild a big chunk of what's left. A good example of that is right here in my own backyard. There's a mountain range called the Gallatin Range. It's one of the major mountain ranges of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and a number of grassroots conservation organizations are supporting wilderness for the entire roadless portion of the northern Gallatins. And I should backtrack and say real quickly that the southern Gallatin Range is actually within Yellowstone National Park, contiguous with the northern Gallatins, which are national forest land. And most of the citizen grassroots groups are supporting a 250,000-acre Gallatin Range wilderness north of the park. But groups including the Greater Yellowstone Coalition and the Wilderness Society and Wild Montana, those are three groups that have cut a deal with off-road vehicle enthusiasts to eliminate most of the wilderness proposal in this misbegotten idea of not wanting to offend people and make enemies. And I think that's a sad situation, and it's an erroneous way of looking at things. These groups think that if they make a watered-down proposal, everybody will be happy and they'll get the legislation passed. And in fact, all you end up with is more destroyed habitat. And anybody with any common sense, and Donald Trump even understands this, not that he has any common sense, but you don't go to a negotiation and show your cards and propose a compromise at the outset of the process. Our political system is based on compromise, but it's also based on the need for advocacy groups to advocate. The politicians will do the compromising. It's not our job as conservationists to advocate compromise, because the less you ask for, the less you're going to get in the long run.
We may only have time for one or possibly two questions, and I want to ask this one. I'm skipping through others here. You have advocated for the creation of a wilderness agency at the federal level. Can you talk to us about this?
You've done your homework. And yes, I'm not the only person advocating it, but I think that the creation of an agency that we'll call, let's say, the National Wilderness Service would be a tremendous help to making sure that agency bureaucrats actually manage wilderness to keep it wild. Because as I mentioned earlier when I was discussing my history on the board of directors of Wilderness Watch, if given the opportunity, many agency land managers will violate the Wilderness Act and promote water projects, road building projects, construction projects, the use of helicopters and other heavy equipment for wildlife management, predator control, and all sorts of things that are the antithesis of what wilderness is all about. Many of us are coming to the conclusion that having an agency whose sole mission was to make sure that wilderness is wild would be a great help to the effort to preserve wilderness and keep it wild. Because unfortunately, the agencies have proven, particularly the Forest Service, the Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the BLM, that you just can't trust these agencies both to protect potential wilderness, i.e. roadless areas, or to keep existing designated wilderness areas wild. If they can get away with violating the Wilderness Act, they do. So I'm all for the idea of creating a National Wilderness Service to oversee the administration of wilderness and to make sure that the other agencies actually obey the Wilderness Act.
Okay, thank you for that. I have one last question. That's all we have time for. You may have heard that on October 7th, Trump signed an executive order to construct a 211-mile-long private road through the Brooks Range for mining operations, which may begin in the spring of 2026. I can hardly think of a more tragic crime on this scale against the earth. When I heard this news, I felt sick, to tell you the truth, angry and depressed, and it made me aware of how much the struggle for big wilderness is really about feelings and emotions. I am always trying to figure out why so many people do not feel this great loss of wilderness. Would you care to comment on that?
It is a loss, and we are animals with feelings. We have the ability to emote, as do many other forms of life. We're not the only animals that feel emotions, but I've gone through my entire life with this sense of loss, and I've seen many wilderness areas that I had come to really love and feel that oneness with nature in go down the tubes for various reasons. We would be less than human if we didn't feel that sense of loss. The key is don't let that sense of loss overwhelm you. Save a little bit of your life on this planet for actually getting out and enjoying the wild places. Don't take yourself too seriously. Take your job seriously. Take the effort to protect the wild seriously. But we're all just specks of cosmic dust who are here for a blink of an eye in geologic time and make the best of it. And I guarantee you that the best activists, the ones who are most effective at helping to set aside large tracts of wild nature, are those who know wild nature from firsthand experience. So, it's a great sense of loss, but don't let it completely consume your life.
Got it. So before giving you the last word, I want to conclude by saying that the vision you and other members of the original Earth First articulated in the 80s of a true wilderness preservation system that is large enough, diverse enough, and connected enough to sustain the full range of biodiversity remains, in my mind, the single greatest thing we can do right now to achieve a sane and satisfying planetary existence for both humans and non-humans. Thank you, Howie Wolke, for your essential role in evolving this vision of an alternative civilization where we can coexist in peace and harmony with the natural world.
Well, thank you, Glenn. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Okay. Thank you very much, and I hope to talk to you again.
I'd be happy to.
You have been listening to Wild Earth Conversations on KWSI 100.3 radio in Grand Junction, Colorado. More conversations in this series are available at kwsiradio.org or on KWSI's YouTube channel. If you have comments or questions about the show, or if you would like to be a guest, then send me an email, wildearthconversations@kwsiradio.org. Please include a phone number.